Hello, and welcome to our talk today on reporting on city government. So, this is all part of our city government unit. So, let's talk about why reporting on government matters. And the first thing we'll say about that is that decisions made in city government impact the lives of local residents. When you think about these six items that make news, one of the things that we often talk about in those six elements that make news is impact. And that's really the big one that you're trying to bring out in your stories about city government is how will decisions made at the city government level impact the lives of residents within the city. So when you think about, all the things that you'll find within city government stories, you'll certainly find controversy. For instance, what is the city doing about COVID relief for businesses? That could be a pretty controversial one that's going around right now. Also, another one that might be going around right now is because of the pandemic, the city might be looking to cut expenses, might be having to shrink its budget. A lot of cities are with the pandemic going on. So there's going to be controversial decisions made in every city, and there's always going to be people who are in conflict over that. So. Sometimes you'll find some odd or unusual things in city government reporting. Um, Take a look at your city budget sometime and see what the city's actually spending money on. Every now and again, you might find something interesting in there that seems a little out of the norm, but it turns out it's a really good thing. So, check that out. I remember when I was reporting in Cheyenne, Wyoming, they would bring in goats to take care of the weeds along some of the city-owned properties, rather than trying to have hand crews go out there to pick weeds because they were along embankments and things like that. So it wasn't like you could really like run a lawnmower over them or anything or a riding mower. So they hired a dude who brought in a bunch of goats to eat the weeds, and it turns out to be like one of the little charming things about that city is, you might be walking along their greenway and you might run into a herd of goats chomping weeds. So, proximity, of course, is the lifeblood of city government reporting. It's you're reporting on the city, you're reporting on the town itself. And then, of course, timeliness is important. For instance, in the summer of, or in the fall of 2020 here, the city of Fort Collins put down some watering restrictions. And it's important to get that out to residents right away because, right now we're faced with some watering shortages potentially in our area. Nothing to be too worried about, but we do need to start conserving to make sure that we have enough. And part of that stems from the fact that we've had a little bit of a drought, had a very hot summer with not a lot of rain. And then, we've also used a lot of water to fight forest fires in our area. So, that's part of why the watering restrictions are in place, and it's important to get that information out to people so that they can begin conserving. Plus, a lot of times with watering restrictions, the city will tie a penalty to it, so that if you use too much water, they will slap you with a nice fat fine in addition to charging you extra for the water, and it can be a very, very costly mistake for residents if they don't know about it. So we want to get that news out fast. And then, of course, like I mentioned at the very top, impact. Just in general, what are these decisions how are they going to impact your life? And then prominence in all my years of reporting at various government meetings, school boards, city councils, etc., etc., I have yet to meet a person of prominence other than the council members themselves. So yeah, you're not gonna run into Arnold Schwarzenegger, former governor of California, and of course the Terminator, or anybody else of similar prominence. If you do, good for you. So remember from your civics classes back in high school, your U.S. government classes, that there are three branches of government: the legislative branch, which would basically be Congress, the executive branch, which would be your president, and then your judicial branch, which would be the Supreme Court. We also have a fourth branch that's enshrined in the First Amendment, the fourth estate of government, also known as the watchdog role, and that is us journalists. We need our answers. And so journalists are there, the media is there to watch these three branches of government to make sure that they are continuing to act in the best interest of Americans, that they're not, skimming money, taxpayer money away to, fund their private parties or to enrich themselves or anything like that. So, At the local level, it's much the same. So we have a legislative branch. This legislative branch is the Fort Collins City Council. There's also an executive branch that is headed by the city manager, that is Mr. Darren Rudloff. And then we also have a judicial branch here at the local level, and that would be our district court system. And yes, we have the Fourth Estate here in Fort Collins as well, and that would be the reporters in this class, as well as the reporters at Student Media, the Colorado and the North 40, and all the other local media in town. So yes, we always have our Fourth Estate. So let's talk some facts about Fort Collins city government now. It's important to know how Fort Collins city government operates so that you know what you're looking at when you go to cover it. So Fort Collins has what we call a city manager form of government. Denver, Pueblo, Colorado Springs, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and others have what we would call a mayor-council form of government that would probably more closely mirror what we see at the federal level, where your council is the legislative branch and your mayor is part of the executive branch. Here in Fort Collins, with the city manager form of government, the mayor is actually a part of the city council. And so, thusly, the mayor is actually part of the legislative branch here. The executive branch would be Darren Rudloff, but he doesn't necessarily have the power to veto the city council the way that the president can veto a bill from Congress. He is hired by the city council to run the executive form of government, and he takes his cues from the council, and that's what a city manager does. And I suppose if a city manager very much opposes a directive from the council, they can always protest it. I guess they can always resign in protest, but they wouldn't have that same type of veto power. Fort Collins owns 5 different utilities here in the city. One of them is water, the water that we drink. One of them is wastewater treatment, otherwise known as sewer. One of them is stormwater treatment. One of them is electric. And the newest one is broadband. So if you have Fort Collins Connection, that would be your broadband. We also have some private utilities that do work in the area. So parts of Fort Collins may have another utility to provide water, broadband, natural gas, trash removal, etc. We don't have a city utility that does natural gas, and nor do we have a city utility that does trash removal. Those are all through private companies. We do have some broadband providers that still operate in the area besides Connection. Of course, CenturyLink and Comcast are the big 2 there. And then as far as water goes, if you're on the north side of Fort Collins, for instance, you don't have city water. You're part of the Eastern Larimer County Water Board there. So the primary revenue for the city is sales tax. So every time you go out to eat, every time you put gas in your car, every time you purchase something at all, you are putting money into the city of Fort Collins to help pay for the various services that they provide to us as residents. And that would be the same in just about every town across America as well. Fort Collins normally has a budget around $600 million. The council is looking at cutting about $13 million from that budget here in the fall of 2020. And again, that's because of COVID. So some more facts about the city council. There are 7 members of the council. The city is divided into 6 districts, and each district gets 1 representative on the council, and then the mayor is elected at large to represent the entire city. The mayor is, again, not a member of the executive branch. He is a voting member of the council, just like everyone else. As far as legislation goes, there are generally 2 types of legislation that you will see in front of a city council. One is resolutions, and one is ordinances. And if you check out this PowerPoint that is also with this video, you can hit those links to see some examples of what resolutions look like and what ordinances look like. But in general, resolutions are statements of intent. Ordinances are actually local laws. So you might get a resolution saying that, Jane Doe is being appointed to the Planning and Zoning Commission. That is the right of the city council to, appoint people to the Planning and Zoning Commission. They don't necessarily have to have a public hearing for it. It is just one of those things that they can declare through a resolution, and they do that appointment. An ordinance is a local law. So, for instance, you might have an ordinance about homeless people. One of the most famous ordinances here in Fort Collins that affect college students is the U+2 ordinance that says, you can only live with with a max of two people who are not related to you. So those are different types of legislation. There are different types of meetings that City Council will take part in. The first one that we'll talk about here is work sessions. They usually have around 2 work sessions a month, sometimes more. These are times where the City Council will get together. They will not vote on issues, but they will talk about issues. They will hear presentations from people, and they will basically, do the kind of discussion and hear the kind of information that will help them make an informed decision when it does come time to have a scheduled council meeting. These are the meetings that we're going to cover in this class. These will include a long public comment session, usually at the beginning, where citizens can get up and talk about whatever it is that they feel concerned about that they want to bring to the council. And that can be a good opportunity to find stories here in the city. So you always want to be there for the public comment session, because sometimes that can be the most lively part of the meeting. Once you are in session, that's when you will have an agenda, and the city council will go through and talk about the various items on the agenda. Sometimes that will include the same kinds of things that you will see in work sessions, like discussions and presentations and things like that. But then they will usually vote. They, of course, cannot vote unless they have a quorum. So a quorum means that you need to have a majority of the members there in order to pass a vote. So imagine with a 7-person council, let's say 6 people were sick, and 1 person got to make the decision all to themselves. That wouldn't exactly be democratic. So you have to have a majority. So if you don't have at least, I can't remember if it's 4 or 5, but you have to have enough people there to constitute a quorum to even have the meeting, much less to be able to vote on anything. If the city council meets without a quorum, and if they take votes on anything, then they will have violated the Colorado Open Meetings Act, and that could potentially get them in some trouble. And then occasionally, City Council will have special hearings when they have particularly controversial or impactful issues in front of them. They might have a special hearing just to garner public comment. So when it comes time to passing either a resolution or an ordinance, usually you get 2 reads in City Council for an ordinance. 2 reads means that they will talk about the ordinance at 2 different meetings. They will hold votes at 2 different meetings, and if the votes pass at both of those meetings, then that ordinance becomes law. Here is a fun story for you from my reporting past. I previously went to college. When I went to college, I attended the University of Wyoming in Laramie. And one year, the Laramie City Council decided that it would be very important for them to pass an anti-nudity ordinance in Laramie. So this anti-nudity ordinance in Laramie at the time, they did 3 readings on ordinances. And the first 2 times that this ordinance is read, hardly anybody shows up. There's not much discussion. It sails through no problem. After the second ordinance, I was the editor of my college paper at the time. We started writing about what was actually in the ordinance. A concerned citizen brought us the bill and said, "Hey, check this out. There's some stuff in here that's not quite right." One of the provisions of the bill would have barred the UW Theater Department from performing any play that had nudity to it, and they didn't want their artistic freedom stepped on like that. So the theater department and most of the students opposed the bill. The UW art department opposed the bill because this would have it was written in such a way that at the time, the art department, just like many art departments, will employ students to be nude models for other students, or any citizen really, to be nude models for students to draw, and this would have basically outlawed that practice. But the real kicker in the I am so sorry about my dog there, y'all. The real kicker of the story, though, was there was a provision in the ordinance that said that young males should not appear in public in a, quote, discernibly turgid state, which is to say that young boys should not appear excited in public. And I'll let your imaginations run away from that. So obviously that seemed like a really bad idea. And, by the time that third reading came around, the public was packed to the rafters in the city council chambers, demanding that it be voted down. The city council heard their complaints, voted it down, and the ordinance never came to be. So. And then with resolutions, you only need one read on those, and those will usually be fairly, generally those are going to be non-controversial. You can have a public comment on ordinances. Public comments will happen at meetings, but not at work sessions. But yeah, that's what the public comment part is for at the regular meetings and not the work sessions. So, some documents you should be familiar with when you're on a city council beat. One of them is an agenda. This is what's going to come out a few days before the meeting that's going to tell you exactly what they're going to talk about at this meeting. There is always the possibility of adding things to the agenda at the last minute. There's even the possibility of, adding things to the meeting in the middle of the meeting. But the agenda is usually going to be there to lay out for you everything that's ahead for the night, everything that's ahead for that night. Part of the agenda will include what's called the consent agenda. So city council, especially when you're talking about a city the size of Fort Collins, will have a million different things going on at any one time, and so the city council, usually at work sessions, will, as they talk about the different things that they're working on, there will be recommendations made to move things to what's called the consent agenda. And so this is basically like everything kind of gets grouped into one vote. They vote for the consent agenda. It usually passes, on a unanimous vote, and then those resolutions and ordinances become a thing. Occasionally, a city council member might object to something being on a consent agenda, and they will ask that that item be removed so that they can have a full hearing on it. The City Council will also publish voting records for each council member. So if you're ever interested in seeing, who exactly voted on a bill, or who voted against a bill, or who abstained from a bill, those are all going to be public record on fcgov.com. And then the other thing that you will find in documents there on fcgov.com are meeting minutes. Meeting minutes are great when you have to go back and do research on an issue. Say if something that had happened 10 years ago suddenly surfaces again and you want to go back to see what was said about it in council 10 years ago, then meeting minutes are great. But usually meeting minutes are not great for writing your story there on the spot because the minutes, are not approved until the next meeting. And by that point, they're kind of old news. So great for research purposes, but don't really help you in terms of, writing the story immediately. So let's talk about how are you reporting the story. So first of all, we need to talk about what medium you're going to use, right? Because you want to report to the medium. So if you're, say, reporting on Twitter, maybe you're tweeting out some live updates. And that's a very handy thing for people if they want to, kind of follow along with what the big news of the night is without having to invest much attention to it. Audio and video are great when you want to dive into one particular issue. So, a lot of times the stuff that, there's a million things said at a city council meeting, and trying to wrap them all into a story is almost impossible. It would be, probably 10 pages long, and people would get tired of it, very, very quickly. So instead, we usually try to focus on one or two stories that the public really, really needs to know about and, tell them. And audio and video are really good for that, or they're great for diving into single issue reporting. Whereas, written media, whether that be print or whether that be web writing, is really good for rounding up all the big points from a meeting. Certainly not everything that happened in a meeting, but depending on everything that's, whatever's on the agenda, sometimes that might be the focus on one big thing, and maybe you put a few bullet points at the end that just says, another news city council decided to, and then, bang out three things after that. Or, it could be that you focus on three different major things and use subtitles in your story to separate them out and, write about all the debate and how the vote goes and what's next for it. So it just kind of all depends on what happens at the meeting itself. So as far as storytelling goes, if you're going to be doing, written content, uh, please use the inverted pyramid. You want to start with the most interesting aspect and then proceed from there. You do not, for the love of God, tell stories chronologically at a city council meeting. Okay, so a city council meeting is not a football game. Nobody wants the play-by-play of a city council meeting. If they cared that much, they would come to the meeting. What they're looking for is a report. They're looking for a summary. They're looking for, what was the most important thing I need to know, and then I'm going to go about my day. And so that's why the inverted pyramid is going to work great for you on city council stories, because you can just, dive into what were those most interesting aspects and then, not even include or downplay the parts that were not that important. Make sure that you also talk to impacted residents. Use them to show the controversy and the impact of, whatever the issue might be. So, for instance, at a city council meeting in the spring of 2020, or I'm sorry, yeah, it was in the spring of 2020. I took a class to the city council meeting. This was pre-COVID, and there were citizens from the Library Park neighborhood of Fort Collins. That would be the neighborhood that kind of borders Old Town, where the Old Town Library is. They came to the meeting because they had some major concerns about homeless people in their area and some of the crime that might come with the homeless population. Residents were talking about, finding camping gear stashed in their backyards where people had been sleeping, not feeling safe, finding dirty needles. It felt like a public safety hazard, and they, turned up in droves. Probably 20 different households showed up to the meeting to give a quick, 2 to 3, 4, 5 minute testimony about what, the problems the neighborhood was having, and to try to get city council's attention on it. So we ended up doing several follow-up stories from this class out of that. We went and we walked the neighborhood. We talked to some different residents, knocked on their doors, asked them for, some of their, to ask them to tell us their stories. We tried to talk to some of the homeless people in the neighborhood to see if, they felt like they were being targeted unfairly by these accusations. We talked to the chief of police. But the thing that we did that night at the actual city council meeting was a couple of our students got up and, after people had testified, and followed them out into the lobby and interviewed them right there on the spot, just to get, another take, a little bit more information over what they had said, right there in the city council chambers. And it ended up being some really good stories that we got out of that. So. And then remember too that the best city council stories happen after the meeting. So, like just in that story I just told, the students who got up and talked to the people giving public comment right after the fact, that was a really good move because you could talk to people right then and there. But the students who went and talked to the homeless people to get the other side of the story, to get the other perspective, they ended up with some of the best stories out of the class. So remember that the best city council stories happen after the meeting. City council stories are where you are. City council is where you hear about great stories. That's where you follow the legislative process of the great story. But ultimately, the great story you tell is going to be through, diving into the subject wholeheartedly and explaining it to the public. So remember too that there's a watchdog role we have with city council meetings, and that's part of the reason why old school editors will say that you should always stay for the entire meeting. Most newspapers and TV stations don't do this anymore because they don't necessarily want to pay somebody to sit there and listen to the entire city council meeting. A lot of times they will say, go for what your agenda, for when you think your agenda item is going to be discussed, stay for that, write the story, go home. We don't want to pay you to have to sit there until 2 in the morning if it's a real long meeting, and potentially pay overtime for that. Old school editors were willing to do that because, once the press kind of turns away, that's when, sometimes people will take advantage of situations, and maybe they'll have a vote that essentially becomes a secret vote, even though by the letter of the law it's allowed because, everybody was there at 6, but nobody stayed at 11 when, everybody got tired. So, that watchdog role is still really important for journalists to do. And this is why we probably should make sure that we're reading through things like the minutes of the meeting, and maybe calling our sources the next day just to say, hey, did anything happen after this point in the meeting? Just to, make sure that there is nothing secretive that happens. But that watchdog role is still a really important thing that we do. We should ask follow-ups with people who give public comments after the public comment period, like I explained in that story before, because that's an awesome opportunity to, make connections with people in your community. So even if you don't, get anything new out of them right then and there, you might get something new out of them in the next day or two as the story develops. And then, as you stay late for meetings too, the one big advantage of staying through the end of the meeting is that you can very easily grab the city manager or members of the council and ask them follow-ups right after the meeting. So if there was something that happened that, maybe you were a little fuzzy on, you weren't able to follow it all that well, you can, jump up and get some questions clarified before you go write your report that night. So, and then, to help with that last thing there, of course, do your research ahead of time. Make sure you know like what the issues are going into the city council meeting. Get that agenda. Read through the agenda. They will usually attach a lot of background information with the agenda. So, agendas don't just end up being, a single page, with, you know, here are the 10 things we're going to do tonight. Agendas actually end up being like big, thick packets of information that do have that page of, here's what we're going to do tonight. But then you have, appendix A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so on and so forth that are going to back up each one of those agenda items. So they're very thorough. So now that we've learned a little bit about the city council, we're going to do a treasure hunt. So I want you to go to Canvas. I want you to find this quiz, in-class quiz, find key people in Fort Collins city government. You're going to use Fort Collins government's website, fcgov.com, to tell me who the mayor is, who the city council members are, when their term limits are up. You're going to tell me who run a couple of key departments in the city. Everything is open book, open note, open internet. Use your Google skills. But like I said, every answer will be found on the Fort Collins City Government website, and it is linked in the quiz instructions for you to get to easily. So good luck, and if you have any questions, if you get stumped anywhere, be sure to message me, and I'd be happy to help you out. Thanks so much.